Next up, we have Richard Berg with the Humanists of Colorado. He is based out of Denver and will be giving us an introduction to humanism.
Thanks for making it back right after lunch. Does this thing still work when my hands aren't on it, or do I have to push it close for it to work? Good? Okay. I'm not the best person to begin this talk. The best person to begin this talk is the one who's giving our 3:30 seminar, who actually has been involved in the humanist movement for decades, but since he's already given a long seminar later, I'm giving this talk on introduction to humanism. Like I said, I'm with the Humanists, like Natasha said, I'm with the Humanists of Colorado out in Denver. We've been around for about 30 years. And pretty much an educational type group. We have monthly speakers and so on. We're only recently, in the last year or two, getting into more activist type stuff, volunteering, charitable work and so on. So I'm especially looking forward to Justice talk later on Humanists Doing Good, the local group. That's one of our main reasons for coming all the way out here to Grand Junction to hear what they have to say. I'm going to talk about humanism because it's a term that people don't really understand much. They get it confused with humanitarianism or the humanities, or human beings in general, and I'm going to explain what it means to a humanist, and I'm going to do so largely from a historical context. But let me motivate my talks by saying that to me as a human being, it just seems totally natural that I would be a humanist, because what else would you expect a human to be? In the same way that a moose should be a moosist, and think that moose are the most important thing in the world. A turkey vulture would think turkey vultures are the most important thing in the world. A humanist would think humanists are the most important thing in the world. It's just kind of obvious. But of course, it turns out that the majority of people in this country, at least, don't think that humans are the most important thing in the world. They think that some being that they've never had any direct contact with, who kind of controls everything, is the most important thing in the world. And that humanists believe differently from that. Another part of my talk is try to explain, this slide didn't I see come out right in the move from my software to PowerPoint, so there are a couple of other terms that are missing. Hopefully they'll show up on a later slide. There are a lot of terms that have humanism in the title that are bandied about that people don't really understand. I'm going to try to explain what they are by giving a kind of historical view of the humanism down through the ages. These come out of the American Humanist Association website, and these are, what you see are only about half of them. And the website itself doesn't explain very well. Sorry to Fred Edwards, who wrote the page that I got these from. So I'm going to try to do a better job now by going down through history and explaining how humanism kind of got started and so on. So in the earliest time, humans, we were just kind of survivalists more than we were humanists. And just trying to get along, we were also groupists, as modern biologists talk about it. We had our, families and our tribes and so on. But one thing was that people in the olden days saw supernatural agents there where they lived. There was a god for the waterfall, and a god for the wheat to come up, and a god for the beings that jump around in the trees and so on. And so they just naturally assumed, really, or maybe deduced that there were these all-powerful beings that made everything happen around them. And this animism, as we call it now, to me anyway, is the basis of all this later religious belief. It's just really the same thing, just with different names for those gods. Society sprang up, and here's an image of an early god of agriculture, I think, from the Sumerian god. Religions came up with leaders, and they've stayed with us up to the present day. It's kind of a natural thing how this stuff happened. It wasn't anything, people didn't say, oh, I'm going to try to build the rest of humanity out of their free thought by finding this religion. That's just not the way it happened. 2,500 years ago or so, there were kind of non-theistic quasi-religions that sprang up all over the world. China, probably also Buddhism in India, and Greek thought and so on. One common example was Confucius in early China. We still hear about Confucianism today, although in China itself, I think Confucianism is not as popular as it was just up until the communist takeover several decades ago. At about the same time in China, we had Taoism, which we all know at least the symbol, the yin-yang symbol from Taoism. We're maybe not too familiar with the rest of it, but that was another one that didn't really, was very humanistic in the sense of not being based on the belief in some supernatural deity. Buddhism, kind of the same way. I don't have a slide about that. But these two Chinese religions were, for thousands of years dominated thought in that part of the world. It's kind of a philosophical humanism in the sense of the way of life centered on human ideals. So Confucius was all about family, tradition, even ancestor worship. I don't know if ancestors maybe were a little bit like gods and so on. It's not really the way we think of humanism in the West today. I'll get to that some slides later, but it was a kind of a philosophical humanism, and that's the first of the terms that I listed there to try to explain them. So philosophical humanism, if you run across that somewhere, it doesn't necessarily imply any particular worldly kind of branch of humanism, including our Western one, but more of a generic type of humanism. Non-theistic philosophy was very important in the classical era in Europe, especially in Greece, where logic and mathematics were, at least in our part of the world, sort of not exactly founded, but became very important. Democritus here talked about atoms in those days. That's why that symbol is up there. Even people in that day and age, 2,500 years ago, tried to explain things not based on animistic, not based on mysterious gods who made things happen, but based on just trying to explain things because that's how nature was. Atoms bouncing around or whatever. Of course, Greek philosophy was important in these ways too. Aristotle, he wrote on ethics. Observational science, not so much deductive science based on experiment, but observational science certainly with Aristotle and logic. And this stuff has been handed down to us today. A lot of these aspects of Greek and even Roman culture have come through. They managed to make their way through the whole Middle Ages thing and came out today. Democracy, law, logic, mathematics, and so on. And these are more like the basis of our modern Western cultural heritage. And if you hear the term Western cultural humanism, that's what people refer to. They don't mean the kind of humanistic thought expressed by Confucius or Lao Tzu or Buddha, which are kind of humanistic in their way. They mean the kind of humanistic thought maybe started in Greece, came through the Renaissance, came through the Enlightenment, and that's the kind of stuff that we wrap our heads around today. So that's Western cultural humanism. By the way, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question at any time. I'm happy to take questions at any point in time. You don't have to wait for the end. Western cultural humanism, the second of these terms I wanted to try to get a grip on. Now they're all showing up here. I don't know what happened there. Well, the Roman Empire wasn't particularly humanistic. They liked a lot of what Greece had done in terms of writing and so on. They were good engineers in ancient Rome, but they were also all about power and so on, like maybe like our country is a little bit today. But a few hundred years, or about 380 in the Common Era, they took this kind of what was a niche religion, Christianity, and raised it up to being, sort of official, and then started a good 1,000 years and more of Christianity pretty much dominating Europe. We call that the Dark Ages now, and that later on the Renaissance and the other movements in Europe were kind of in opposition to that. So the Renaissance was the rebirth of the stuff that came before Christianity, the Greek thought, the Roman thought, and so on. So there was a long time when Christianity, you had the Inquisition, of which there were many types, the Spanish Inquisition, and later it was called the Roman Inquisition, which still kind of officially lasted until 100 years ago or something like that, even though they didn't do this sort of thing so much in the recent centuries. But there was a dark time in Europe. Some things still kept moving forward, but they lost a lot of what they had known in the Greek and Roman times. They lost a lot of technology. The technology of the Romans was in many ways better than the technology at the start of the Renaissance. It's said at the start of the Renaissance where we first meet the term humanist in the Italian form of humanista, and really the Renaissance started out in Italy, specifically I would have to say in Florence, where almost everything that happened in the Renaissance seems to have happened. In particular, the first people were just interested in the ancient Greek and Roman writings. They got the old books. They traveled maybe, and on their travels picked up these books, started reading them again, passed them around, not names like Dante, but there were Plutarch, I think, was one of these guys who did this sort of thing. We still have the term literary humanist or literary humanism. It's not really a type of humanism or a type of humanism. It's more a type of literary appreciation. In other words, it's if you're a literary person and you're interested not in the biblical text stuff, but in the stuff that was non-theistic, probably in the early period, then that literary humanism refers to that. But you see that bandied about as one type of literary humanism. And so if somebody says, are you a literary humanist? It's not really a good question. It should be, are you a literary person who's interested in the humanities, is really what that question is trying to ask. So in the Renaissance, besides literature, people also went back and looked at how the Romans had engineered things and how the Greeks organized things. This hole above the windows of that photo there is one example of that, where somebody from Florence went back to Rome and was allowed to cut a hole in an ancient Roman building called the Pantheon to find out how they built the thing, because they weren't able to build that sort of thing in the Middle Ages. They weren't able to build that type of thing anyway, because the Romans had done with concrete, and they had lost, in the intervening 1,300 years, they lost the recipe for concrete. So they didn't have such a good technology even as the Romans had. But that type of figure, if you hear a Renaissance humanist, that just refers probably to a historical figure. One of these people who was around in the Renaissance, but were interested in learning the Greek and Roman times, as opposed to maybe just a biblical person. So when you hear Renaissance humanism, that refers to maybe a specific time and place or specific individuals that are Renaissance humanists. The result of that guy investigating the dome was they built the greatest piece of architecture from the Renaissance time, the Great Dome in Florence. And there were advances all over, engineering advances, of course, philosophy and so on. One of them was the invention, or possibly only the laying out of the geometric rules for perspective drawing. You know, painting throughout the Middle Ages was like kind of the top of it. This is a relief, not a painting. But it's just some figures in there. And they knew that things in the background would look smaller, but they didn't really know why or understand what was going on. But the guy at this time figured out the geometric rules of the linear perspective. And this, it's not the guy who made these who figured it out, but this is a guy who worked both before and after. The other guy figured it out. And you can just see the difference from the top to the bottom. Here at the bottom, you've got everything converging to in the distance. And this is the same guy, one of the top artists of the Renaissance, Lorenzo Ghiberti. And this was an impact just about 30 years later in his work from this discovery. The idea with perspective is we're not some gods with some objective view of stuff. We're not just drawing stuff out of our mind, but we are humans with a particular viewpoint. And when we put our eyes right here and we look out, here's how we see things. And that ever after this time now, not ever after, because obviously you have a lot of movements in art which go against that. But if you're trying to be realistic, you've got to have a sort of perspective thing going there. So that was one of the big advancements in the Renaissance. An even bigger advancement is just naturalism in general. There's a larger period of time between these two. You see Da Vinci here on the right, though, but just look at how the left one is, I don't know, you might call it something like a cartoon, I suppose. The one on the right, though, very naturalistic and kind of almost the same type of scene, but people look like humans down here in the lower right, and up at the top they look like somebody's idea in their mind, sort of thing. This naturalism was probably the most important thing that came to people's thoughts at that time. European thinkers in general turned their thoughts to the natural world, and science kind of started up. And it wasn't so important now. Throughout the reign of Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, whatever you call it, all those huge cathedrals were built, and people were supposed to feel, when you walk into those, feel small. You're just a little worm who has no importance in the world, and the God is up there, and we are all just. It doesn't matter how happy you are in life, and it doesn't matter what you do. You just, have your obeisance to God and so on. And when people came to figure out, we're part of the natural world, and it's the natural world that's important. That made a lot of changes in people's thought. This, by the way, is not the Copernican system. This is Tycho Brahe's system, which is incorrect, but that's how science is. Science develops. The new philosophers of the European Enlightenment, a couple hundred years after the Renaissance, they believed that God created the world. They were deists. He said, yeah, God created the world sometime, I don't know how long ago. He's not involved anymore. He doesn't answer our prayers. He doesn't expect us to do anything. He gave us the world, and we should do with that world what he would want. If you were creating a world and put a bunch of people there, you'd want them to go enjoy themselves and progress and learn stuff, and that's what we should do too. And that, people should enjoy themselves, not just feel like they're little worms shuffling through a big dark cathedral, but go out and live life as humans should live life. And that, to me, is kind of the genesis of humanism. It's like, we're what's important. We should do what's important for us. Some of these Enlightenment thinkers, especially in France, got rid of this idea of God altogether. They weren't deists anymore. They just said, there is no such thing. This is hundreds of years ago. Obviously, there were atheists, since the dawn of time, probably. But probably at this time, these French Enlightenment thinkers, the line was an unbroken line from them to those of us who are atheists today. And so I've heard people call, for example, Dolbach the first atheist, just in that sense. You go back before him and you can find maybe 100 years when you don't find anything written by anybody who called themselves an atheist. But since that time, now it's always there, so it's a present thing. 15 minutes? All right, thanks, Natasha. So it's very modern already by the time of the European Enlightenment, and this is only a couple hundred years ago. Thomas Jefferson, writing at that time, said that we all have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And notice the words "pursuit of happiness" here. This is not, a Christian Dark Ages thing. They did not think we had the right to the pursuit of happiness, but ever since the Enlightenment, now we do. This is a very mainstream Enlightenment thing, the founding of our country. I want to explain now the two terms, religious humanism and secular humanism. They kind of fit in the historical context here, but only roughly, so I'm going to break about that a little bit. There are humanists who still retain their feeling for their religion. It might be a particular religion, such as, for example, Unitarian Universalists, typically come out of the Christian tradition, even though they don't maybe believe a bunch of the poppycock that Christians believe, but they come out of that tradition, and they like their traditions. They go to church, they have somebody speak to the minister. There's a Jewish humanist group called Bethany, I think it's called. There are, humanistic groups based on any kind of religion. People who like their traditions, I'm a cultural Christian and then I celebrate the Christmas of the tree or whatever, Doesn't make me not a humanist, doesn't really make me a religious humanist either. But people who hold strongly to their religion but still believe in humanistic things might call themselves religious humanists, and they're all over today. Many of you in this room probably fit in that category. This is down the bottom here, religious humanism. Again, these slides got messed up, I guess, in the thing. A secular humanist is someone who is probably atheistic, or at least they think the most important thing is to keep church and state separate. That's the whole secular concept. We heard from the Secular Coalition of America earlier today. This is called the Colorado Secular Conference. So a secular humanist is someone who insists, no, the important thing here is to just keep everything secular, keep religion out of it. They wouldn't say, you have to change any of your particular beliefs, but in the discourse, they would want you to really cut down on that stuff. Here's the majority in today's Europe. Apparently we're up to about 19% in this country, according to Kelly earlier today. So people who don't really have any belief at all. I guess probably secular humanists might even be a little higher than that. Those who fit in that category. So here's on the side, it's supposed to be religious humanism and secular humanism outlined there. Getting into more the modern day, modern humanism emphasizes two things really. Rationalism, which came through that whole Western cultural thing, starting with the Greeks and the logic and the science, and during the Enlightenment and so on. Science is, of course, one of the mainstays of modern thought, and fully embraced by humanists. You won't find too many humanists who talk about how they don't believe all these scientists who say X. Instead, the humanists probably say, all the scientists say X, so that's what we should believe. But the other thing that modern humanism is all about is ethics itself. In fact, the worldwide humanist organization is called the International Humanist and Ethical Union. They thought it was so important a part of it that they put it in the title next to the word humanist, which is pretty interesting. Not to talk about humanist ethics, but certainly things like fairness, compassion, individual liberty, probably a long list of things. In fact, I've got a handout in just a few seconds that gives a good breakdown of what the American Humanist Association, how it defines humanism. In fact, here's the first paragraph of the report, which you maybe pass those on now going down the rows. Progressive philosophy of life that without supernaturalism affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. It's a lot of words, and there are far more on this two-page document coming your way now, which is like the official, almost definition of humanism by the American Humanist Association. There are others. There's the one by the International Humanist and Ethical Union, which is shorter, and I think it's fully contained here, but since you're having one coming out on paper there, we won't bother to go through that one word for word. I want to point out that a slightly different take on it is from the American Humanist Association's president, David Niozzi, who says, okay, not only is all those generic wording important, but he also, notice the central paragraph here, in a recent article in, I think, a Humanist magazine, he listed some things that were core values of humanism, and look at what he lists here. Critical thinking, human rights, naturalism, women's rights and reproductive rights, church-state separation, social and economic justice, peace, global cooperation, environmentalism, restraint of corporate power. More than half of those things fall on the left-hand side of the political spectrum. So for those of you who fall on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, I just want to say that's the way modern humanism is moving. It's kind of a natural thing to think that if we humans are important, then things like, reproductive rights or economic justice, whatever, are probably important too. It doesn't mean humanism is a political thing. It just means that the current, humanism in its current instantiation leans towards the left side on issues like that. And that's, the star is in the wrong place, but that's modern humanism. I just talked for a few minutes about what's going on today. Of course, in this country, we are still the most religious of all the developed nations in the world. But we have a strong national organization, American Humanist Association. This is David Niozzi on the cover of a recent issue of their magazine, the guy who was quoted a couple slides ago. That's not huge, the American Humanist Association. Small membership is healthy, it's growing, but the international version is huge. 5 million individual members, 100-member organizations in dozens and dozens of countries. A place like Norway, the only country in the world that I know that had a worse shooting than Colorado had the other day, anyway, but they have about 100 times the participation in their humanist groups as we have in this country. 100 times as big, 2 orders of magnitude, that's huge. So a lot of the Northern European countries especially are big into humanism. And notice I have as much as 15% of the population there, but probably they said maybe 19% now, so things are moving up. I just want to say that for anybody who is looking for, the term atheism says kind of what you don't believe in. Humanism has a long history and faith says a little bit more. So if you're looking for not exactly a movement, certainly not a religion, but maybe an organization, something with a little push behind it, a little direction behind it, might consider humanism. If you're in the Denver area, we have the Humanist Colorado, Grand Junction area, Humanists Doing Good, and there are other humanist movements around the state as well, so certainly something to look into. I just want to talk for the 5 minutes I have left about some things that are going on in the humanist areas in this state in the next short period of time. If anybody didn't get one of those handouts, raise their hand. We have about 50 of them. We have more than that people here, sorry, but maybe somebody who's coupled up with something to pass them on to somebody who has their hand raised. So we got a few of them who didn't get them. Hopefully there'll be some sitting around probably on chairs afterwards you can grab them. So what do we have coming up in the near future? One thing we have, and is Tom Kellogg here? Tom. Tom is helping organize a convention on Labor Day weekend in downtown Denver, a convention of the Atheist Alliance of America. And he's going to go down the road now and pass some brochures along. This is not a special humanist thing, but several of us on the board of the Humanists of Colorado have been helping organize this. I have myself, I'm the vice president of the Humanists of Colorado. Kimberly over here and other board members have been helping to work on it. This is one thing that we've got going on. Another thing which is, to me, very exciting is something we're trying to start in Denver called the Secular Hub. One problem with organizations like ours, Justin's probably as well, is we don't have a place of our own to meet. We meet in the back of the Unitarian Church, or we meet at a restaurant somewhere where we can get drink deals over happy hour or something like that. So we're trying to rent out a place where any secular-minded group, which would include a Secular Coalition of America people and atheist groups and humanist groups and anybody else who's like-minded could go and meet there. That's called the Secular Hub. We'll be starting it up in, we finally have figured out all the legal ramifications, and we've gotten enough money up at the start, and we're going to start that up. We're having our kickoff meeting a week after the convention that Tom is posting on. That'll be in September. Questions?
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Yep, I've got some time.
Please, thank you. Because I have some, thank you for this wonderful history of Western intellectual history. I'm a historian, a professor of intellectual history.
Sure. And you're having at a loss because I'm not.
I do have one or two issues, I'm a Christian academic. I'm a Christian, I call myself a Christian humanist.
Yep, I had that term on here before, but I took it off in favor of religious humanism.
I saw Erasmus Lutz, who is also one of the leading architects of humanism. And I thought you were going to speak about him, that he was a Catholic priest, and he was a believer, and he also tried to talk about humanist progress on the basis of Christian tradition. Because first of all, Jesus was a hardcore humanist. And then I saw a little bit of, forgive me to use this word, it seemed like a little bit of distorted history of Christianity seems to have reflected. And I want to challenge you. You know that the term humanism is a very recent term.
Actually, it comes from Italian in the 1400s.
No, it's online by German Niedermann.
Maybe in German, but in English they had humanista, which is much of the same meaning. In fact, in those days it referred to somebody who was religious, because everybody in those days was religious. But it was those religious people who were especially interested in reading the ancient writings from Greece and Rome. That was a humanista.
From Latin, I take authority as a Latin professor.
Right.
Humanista, a teacher of pedagogical, someone who teaches education.
Literary humanism. Humanities, right.
It's different, but humanismus, from German humanismus, which is different from humanista, and we cannot conflate it. And so when you go back to ancient antiquities, and you want to impose this understanding of humanism, this is my question I wanted to ask you, you do not seem to have or try to outlay that there are certain criticisms, because you focus on in the Middle Ages, Christianity was this and this, which was okay. There was some problems, but you have to understand that the Guardian, when they were writing, refreshing and reading the Renaissance humanism, they were also importing into modernity those sad experiences like the Colosseum, like all those things that happened in the antiquities, which is also part of the advantage of humanism. Now, personally,
if I may paraphrase your question, I'm not, excuse me, I've only got 2 minutes left here. I think your question is, isn't it true that you I think your question is, isn't it true that you are not really a historian, and isn't it true that the stuff up here would not hold up in a historical lecture? And you're right, I'm not a historian, but I will say, that as an attempted overview of the history of the terms humanism and how they go, it's as close as I can see. You might be mistaking this for Humanism 301, I think, instead of Humanism 101, in which case your question could possibly be answered by the speaker. Unfortunately, this question cannot be, so I'm sorry. Yeah, I think so too. Thanks for trying, but I'm not able to answer a question like that. I barely understood it myself. Is there anybody else in the 2 minutes I have left who would like to ask a question? Yes?
You've left out all of the literature here. You said anything about free thinkers. Now, free thinkers, we embrace all these things that you said, but have maybe a few collateral issues that differentiate them from humanists. Would you care to comment on that?
No, but you might if you have an opinion on that.
Well, I think the term freethinkers is a broad category of people who embrace the scientific, rational, logical approach to life and to many issues in life. In what respect we freethinkers differ from humanists, I would say that perhaps humanists are a little more tolerant, despite this gentleman's objections, to religious faith. We freethinkers, I think, for the most part, but not necessarily, are atheists. And so I think it might have been somewhat appropriate to have drawn some kind of a parallel or distinction in your descriptions of freethinkers.
Thank you. There are many terms that are bandied about: humanist, atheist, freethinker, and many others. And another interesting topic would be a comparison of those terms and how they differ from each other. I did mention atheist and how a humanist probably brings more to the table in terms of what direction they want to go than an atheist does. Freethinker has always been to me a little bit mysterious. It just seems to be another way of saying atheist to me. So I understand you think that's not the case. So maybe next year's conference you can talk on definition of freethinking 101. All right, thank you everybody. Natasha, you've got another talk just to introduce here? No, I think I'm good. Thank you everybody.